Night settles over the land of ancient Egypt with almost no hurry at all. The last light of the sun fades beyond the western desert, leaving behind a sky that slowly deepens from warm gold into soft violet, and then into a darkness that feels endless. The heat of the day begins to loosen its grip on the earth. The warm desert wind grows gentler. Along the banks of the Nile, the river continues its quiet journey, carrying cool air across fields that only hours before shimmered beneath the bright afternoon sun. This is a world without electric lamps, without glowing windows stretching into the distance, without streets filled with steady light. Once the sun disappears, darkness returns in a way that is difficult to imagine today. It comes softly, but it comes completely. Only scattered points of flame remain. A small clay oil lamp flickers inside a humble mud brick home. Another burns inside the workshop of a potter who has stayed awake a little longer to finish shaping tomorrow's bowls. Far across the village, a temple keeps a few sacred lamps glowing before quiet statues whose faces disappear into shadows. Beyond those tiny circles of light lies a darkness so deep that even familiar paths become uncertain. Tonight, we walk slowly into that darkness. Not because it is frightening, but because it was simply part of everyday life. For millions of ordinary people who lived beside the Nile, night was not something to conquer. It was something to accept. The darkness shaped every evening, every family meal, every journey home, every hour of sleep, and every quiet conversation whispered before morning returned. As the stars slowly appear overhead, the sounds of the day begin to change. The loud voices of merchants fade from the marketplace. Stone hammers fall silent at building sites. Donkeys stop carrying heavy baskets. Children finish their games before parents gently call them indoors. Even the birds seem to settle into quieter songs. The village breathes differently now. The smell of warm bread still lingers in the air. Smoke from cooking fires rises slowly before disappearing into the cooling sky. Somewhere nearby, someone grinds grain a little longer while tomorrow's flour is prepared. A woman folds woven mats near the doorway of her home. An elderly man washes dust from his feet using a small clay bowl filled with Nile water. Every movement grows slower. There is no reason to rush. Darkness encourages patience. Inside one modest house, a family gathers after another long day beneath the Egyptian sun. The walls around them are made from dried mud bricks shaped months or years before by hands much like their own. The floor beneath them is packed earth, swept carefully every morning. Their home is simple, yet familiar. Every corner carries memories of ordinary life. The father has spent the day helping repair irrigation canals that guide the precious Nile water across nearby fields. His shoulders ache from lifting wet soil beneath the heavy sun. His hands carry small cracks from days of hard work. Dust still clings to his sandals. His wife has spent much of her day grinding grain into flour. The work seems gentle from a distance, yet it requires steady strength. Hour after hour, heavy grinding stones turn wheat and barley into fine meal. Her arms are tired now. She sits quietly, letting the evening breeze cool her skin. Their children have helped where they could. One gathered firewood. Another carried water jars. The youngest watched carefully, slowly learning the endless routines that filled nearly every day of Egyptian life. Tonight, their meal is modest. Fresh bread rests beside onions and beans. A small dish of fish caught earlier in the Nile sits nearby. There may be dates if the harvest has been kind. Sometimes there is beer made from barley, thick and nourishing rather than clear like modern drinks. Nobody expects great feasts. Ordinary evenings are built upon simple food and quiet company. The family eats slowly while the small oil lamp beside them gives just enough light to see each other's faces. The flame dances whenever the breeze slips through the doorway. Every shadow moves gently across the walls. Outside, darkness continues to deepen. The moon has not yet risen. Without it, the village becomes almost invisible. A traveler walking between homes must know every path by memory. A misplaced step may find loose stones, uneven ground, or shallow irrigation ditches hidden beneath the night. Most people simply remain at home. There is little reason to wander after sunset. The work of tomorrow begins before dawn, and precious lamp oil must not be wasted. Oil is valuable. Every drop matters. The little clay lamps that brighten Egyptian homes seem simple enough. Many are no larger than a person's hand. Their shallow bowls hold a small amount of oil while a twisted linen wick drinks slowly from the surface. The flame they produce is warm but modest. It cannot brighten an entire room. Instead, it creates a tiny island of comfort surrounded by darkness. Children naturally move closer to it. Adults lower their voices. Hands become easier to see than distant walls. The world shrinks into a peaceful circle of golden light. Beyond it, the night quietly waits. Most Egyptians would never experience the kind of bright nighttime that people know today. They would never see long rows of glowing windows or roads lit from one end to another. Instead, they became deeply familiar with shadows. Their eyes learned patience. Their feet memorized familiar ground. Their lives adjusted to the rhythm of daylight. The stars above Egypt seemed astonishingly bright. With almost no artificial light rising into the sky, the heavens stretched across the desert in breathtaking clarity. Thousands upon thousands of stars shimmered above the Nile Valley. The Milky Way spread across the sky like a faint river of pale dust. Ancient people looked upward often. Farmers noticed familiar stars returning with the changing seasons. Boatmen used them while traveling the Nile before sunrise. Temple priests carefully observed the heavens for religious ceremonies and calendars. Children simply wondered about the glowing points overhead. For many families, these stars became faithful companions through countless peaceful nights. The river itself reflected their light. Its surface rarely stood completely still. Gentle currents carried tiny ripples south to north while cool breezes brushed across the water. Moonlight, when it appeared, scattered itself into thousands of shimmering pieces. A fisherman resting beside his tide boat might watch those reflections until sleep quietly arrived. His work would begin long before sunrise. Fish do not wait for comfort. His woven nets rest neatly beside him. Wooden floats lie ready. Small clay weights hang carefully from ropes repaired many times before. Every knot matters. Every net represents food for tomorrow. He stretches his tired back and listens. The river speaks softly. Tiny waves touch muddy banks. Frogs call from hidden reeds. Insects sing almost without stopping. Occasionally a fish breaks the surface before disappearing again beneath dark water. These sounds become part of the night. No one tries to silence them. Farther inland, fields rest beneath darkness. During daylight these same fields seem full of motion. Farmers bend over crops of barley, wheat, flax, and vegetables. Oxen pull wooden plows through damp soil. Workers carry baskets balanced upon their heads. Children chase birds away from ripening grain. Now all is quiet. Only the faint wind moves across the growing plants. The irrigation channels continue carrying precious water from the Nile. Their slow movement hardly changes whether people watch them or not. Water never truly sleeps. Nearby stands another village. Its houses resemble those scattered all across Egypt. Flat roofs. Small windows. Walls thick enough to soften the fierce daytime heat. Many families spend part of the evening upon these rooftops. The air is cooler there. A gentle breeze arrives more easily. Parents speak quietly while children grow sleepy beside them. Some gaze at the stars. Others simply enjoy the relief that follows another hot day. Sleep does not always come immediately. The desert keeps its warmth for many hours after sunset. Stone walls slowly release heat collected beneath the blazing afternoon sun. Sand remains pleasantly warm beneath bare feet. Even after darkness falls, traces of daylight linger in the earth itself. Eventually cooler air spreads across the valley. Blankets woven from linen may be pulled gently across tired bodies. The village becomes almost silent. Only an occasional cough, a distant animal, or the soft cry of a baby interrupts the calm. Ancient Egyptian nights were not empty. They were simply quieter. A guard walks slowly along the edge of a storage building filled with grain. His responsibility is straightforward. He watches for thieves, wandering animals, or accidental fires. He carries a simple staff and perhaps a small lamp whose flame barely reaches beyond his own footsteps. His ears become more useful than his eyes. He listens. Sand shifts beneath sandals. A breeze moves dry reeds. Somewhere in the darkness a donkey quietly exhales. He recognizes these ordinary sounds. Anything unusual immediately catches his attention. Yet most nights pass peacefully. The grain remains safe. Morning eventually arrives. Elsewhere, inside a scribe's modest home, writing has already ended for the day. Papyrus is too valuable to waste beneath poor lighting. Ink cannot easily be used beside a flickering flame that barely reaches across the room. Instead, scrolls are rolled carefully. Brushes are cleaned. The scribe massages stiff fingers that spent hours copying records for temple officials or merchants. His eyes appreciate the darkness. They have worked hard beneath bright sunlight. Rest is welcome. The same rhythm touches nearly every profession. Builders stop lifting stone. Weavers fold unfinished cloth. Carpenters set aside wooden tools. Metal workers allow glowing furnaces to cool. Life naturally slows because darkness asks it to. There is wisdom hidden inside such a rhythm. The body follows the sun. Work begins with light. Rest arrives with darkness. Very little stands between them. Along the Nile itself, small boats remain tied to wooden posts driven into muddy banks. Their ropes creak gently whenever the current shifts. Cargo covered by woven mats waits for tomorrow's journey. Perhaps it carries jars of oil. Perhaps baskets of grain. Perhaps finely carved furniture traveling toward a wealthy household. Trade pauses overnight. The river continues without hurry. Somewhere beyond sight, jackals wander the desert edges searching for food. Their distant calls occasionally drift across the valley. To ancient ears these sounds belong naturally within the landscape. The desert has its own nighttime life. Humans rarely disturb it. Travel across open desert after sunset requires great familiarity with the land. Landmarks disappear. Sand changes shape beneath shifting winds. Without moonlight, even experienced travelers proceed carefully. Most simply wait until dawn. Patience often proves safer than speed. Inside another home, an elderly grandmother tells quiet stories before children sleep. Her voice is gentle, worn smooth by many years. The stories may speak of wise ancestors, hard-working families, kind gods, faithful animals, or memorable harvests. The children listen beneath dim lamplight. Their eyelids grow heavier. Outside, the stars continue their slow journey across the sky. One by one the youngest drift into dreams. The lamp burns lower. Its oil slowly disappears. Eventually someone gently pinches the wick. Darkness fills the room almost instantly. Not gray. Not dim. Truly dark. Eyes require long moments to adjust. Yet everyone inside knows exactly where they are. They know where blankets rest. Where water jars stand. Where the doorway waits. Familiar places become maps remembered by touch instead of sight. Night after night, year after year, people grow comfortable with this darkness. It is neither unusual nor alarming. It simply belongs to life beside the Nile. Hours pass quietly. The moon finally rises above the eastern horizon. Its pale light spreads slowly across rooftops, temple walls, palm trees, and silent fields. Shadows become softer. Paths appear once again, though only faintly. A traveler continuing his journey now walks with greater confidence. The moon offers enough guidance without speaking a single word. Temple walls glow gently beneath its light. Tall columns cast long shadows across empty courtyards. Sacred statues watch silently from their places. Even the grandest monuments become peaceful at night. Without crowds. Without ceremonies. Without busy workers. Only stone. Moonlight. And silence. The darkness of ancient Egypt was deeper than many imagined because it remained mostly untouched. There were no distant cities glowing beyond the horizon. No bright towers. No endless rows of lamps. When clouds covered both moon and stars, the world could almost disappear. People accepted this naturally. They planned around it, lived with it, slept within it. And each morning, when the first faint light appeared once more above the eastern desert, the entire rhythm of life quietly began again. Long before the first hint of sunrise reached the eastern horizon, the night still held the Nile Valley in its quiet embrace. The stars remained bright above the sleeping villages, scattered across the dark sky in countless shining patterns that generations of Egyptians had watched since childhood. The air felt cooler now than it had only a few hours before. The heat stored inside the mud brick walls slowly drifted away into the open desert, leaving homes peaceful and still. Most families were asleep. The small oil lamps that had glowed during the evening had long since gone dark. Their clay bowls sat quietly on low shelves or beside woven sleeping mats, waiting to be filled again when another evening arrived. Without their gentle flames, every room rested in complete darkness. Inside one modest home, a father stirred before anyone else. He did not wake because of a clock. No bells marked the hour. No mechanical sound interrupted the silence. Instead, years of repeating the same daily routine had taught his body when to rise. His eyes opened naturally, while outside the world was still covered in night. For a few moments he remained still. The room around him could not yet be seen. His wife and children were only quiet shapes beneath linen blankets. He listened before moving. The soft breathing of his family. The distant whisper of the Nile. The occasional rustle of palm leaves outside. Nothing unusual disturbed the calm. Carefully, he stood, feeling the cool earth beneath his feet. Every movement was familiar. He knew exactly where the doorway stood, where yesterday's sandals rested, and where the water jar waited near the wall. He needed no light. Ancient Egyptians often knew their homes almost entirely by memory. Their hands found shelves without searching. Their feet avoided baskets without looking. Years of living in the same simple spaces made darkness feel less like blindness and more like quiet familiarity. He stepped outside. The village seemed almost empty. Only a handful of other early workers moved silently through the narrow paths between houses. Their figures appeared only as faint outlines beneath the stars. No one spoke loudly. Morning had not yet fully arrived, and there seemed little reason to disturb the peaceful silence. Far above them, the heavens remained astonishingly clear. The dry Egyptian air allowed the stars to shine with remarkable brightness. Every season brought familiar constellations that farmers, fishermen, priests, and travelers recognized without effort. These patterns became part of everyday life, quietly guiding work and marking the passing months. The Nile itself reflected the stars like another sky stretching across the earth. The surface moved gently, breaking each reflection into tiny pieces that shimmered with every ripple. A cool breeze traveled along the water, carrying with it the faint smell of wet reeds and fresh mud left behind by earlier floods. Near the riverbank, several fishermen were already preparing their boats. Their work depended upon the earliest hours of daylight. Waiting until the sun climbed high into the sky would make the labor harder beneath the growing heat. Each man checked his nets with practiced hands. A broken cord might mean losing part of the day's catch. A loose knot could waste hours of work. Every detail mattered because every meal depended upon careful preparation. Their boats were simple. Wooden hulls, worn smooth by years upon the river. Reed baskets stacked neatly near the bow. Clay jars for fresh water. Coiled ropes resting patiently beside wooden oars. Nothing appeared hurried. The fishermen had performed these same quiet tasks hundreds, perhaps thousands, of times throughout their lives. Nearby, another man untied a small donkey from its post. The animal stretched slowly before lowering its head to nibble dry grass. Soon it would carry baskets of vegetables toward the marketplace in a nearby town. But for now, both man and animal enjoyed the last peaceful moments before another demanding day. The donkey knew the roads almost as well as its owner. Together they had walked dusty paths beside canals, through villages, and along fields countless times before. The roads themselves remained almost invisible beneath the darkness. Most were simply worn tracks across firm earth. There were no signposts. No lamps standing beside the way. Only memory guided travelers from one place to another. Yet this was enough. People rarely traveled without knowing exactly where they were going. The land itself became their map. A certain cluster of date palms. A bend in the canal. The outline of a distant hill. The shape of a temple wall rising above nearby houses. These landmarks waited patiently for daylight to reveal them once more. Back inside the village, one family slowly began preparing bread before dawn. The mother poured freshly ground flour into a shallow mixing bowl carved from stone. She added water little by little while kneading the dough with calm, steady movements. The sound was gentle. Soft hands pressing. Dough folding. Wooden bowls touching the floor. Nearby, a small fire was carefully started. Tiny sparks glowed beneath dry reeds before growing into steady flames. The smell of smoke drifted upward through the cool morning air, joining the familiar scent of baking bread that would soon spread across the neighborhood. For countless Egyptians, this smell marked the beginning of nearly every day. Bread was more than food. It was comfort. It was routine. It was one of the simple things that remained dependable through changing seasons and passing years. Children slowly awakened. Still sleepy, they rubbed their eyes while wrapping simple linen garments around themselves. Their day would also begin early. Some would carry water. Others would feed goats or chickens. Some would help sweep the courtyard. Even young children shared small responsibilities within the household. No task seemed too ordinary. Every pair of hands contributed something. As the eastern sky slowly became lighter, colors gradually returned to the landscape. The outlines of palm trees appeared first. Then mud brick walls. Then narrow paths crossing the village. The stars began disappearing one by one. They did not suddenly vanish. Instead, they quietly faded as dawn slowly claimed the sky. This gentle change happened every morning, almost unnoticed by those already busy beginning another day. Nearby, an elderly woman walked carefully toward the village well carrying 2 empty clay jars. The vessels were heavy even before they were filled. Years of carrying water had slightly bent her shoulders, yet her steps remained steady. She greeted another woman passing in the opposite direction. Their conversation stayed soft. Morning had always belonged to quiet voices. Neither wished to disturb the peaceful rhythm surrounding them. They spoke briefly about the coming harvest. About a child recovering from fever. About grain that needed grinding before sunset. Simple conversations. Ordinary concerns. The kinds of words that quietly shaped everyday life far more than royal announcements ever could. Not far away, a young apprentice joined his master inside a carpenter's workshop. The room still smelled pleasantly of cedar and acacia wood. Wood shavings covered the floor where yesterday's work had ended. Simple tools rested neatly against the wall. Bronze chisels. Wooden mallets. Bow drills. Measuring cords. The apprentice carefully swept the floor before beginning his own work. He had much to learn. How to cut straight lines. How to smooth rough surfaces. How to fit joints tightly enough that furniture would remain strong for many years. Patience mattered more than speed. His teacher rarely raised his voice. Instead, knowledge passed quietly from experienced hands to younger ones through steady repetition. Elsewhere, women prepared linen thread. Bundles of flax fibers lay beside them waiting to be spun into fine strands. Fingers moved slowly, twisting each fiber with remarkable skill. The work demanded concentration but not haste. Hours passed gently. Conversation came and went like the breeze. Sometimes they worked in silence. Sometimes they shared family stories remembered from many seasons before. The rhythm of spinning itself became peaceful. Almost like breathing. Along the Nile, the first boats finally pushed away from shore. Wood creaked softly. Water parted beneath the hulls. Oars dipped into the river with slow, practiced movements. Mist hovered just above the water in thin silver ribbons, slowly disappearing beneath the growing light. Birds awakened among the reeds. Their morning calls echoed across the quiet riverbanks. Herons stood motionless, watching patiently for fish. Small flocks of ducks glided across calm water before suddenly lifting into the air together. Nature greeted the morning without hurry. The fishermen watched these familiar sights every day. Perhaps they no longer noticed every detail. Or perhaps they appreciated them more deeply because they appeared so faithfully with each sunrise. Further inland, farmers gathered beside their fields. The coolness of early morning offered the best time for demanding physical labor. Before the fierce afternoon heat arrived, irrigation channels needed clearing. Young plants required careful attention. Tools had to be repaired. Oxen harnessed. Seeds carried. Every season brought its own endless list of quiet responsibilities. The soil itself felt different beneath bare feet. Still damp from recent irrigation. Cool after the long night. Soft enough for careful planting. As the sun slowly climbed higher, that pleasant coolness would disappear beneath growing warmth. Everyone knew this. No one wasted the gentle hours of dawn. Children walking beside their parents often carried smaller baskets. They watched carefully. Learning did not happen inside formal classrooms for most ordinary Egyptians. It happened beside fields, inside kitchens, along riverbanks, within workshops. Knowledge passed from one generation to another through daily life itself. A daughter learned how to prepare grain by standing beside her mother. A son learned how to repair fishing nets while sitting next to his father. An apprentice watched before attempting. Mistakes were corrected gently. Experience accumulated little by little. No single lesson seemed remarkable. Yet together they built entire lives. By now the sunlight touched the upper walls of nearby temples. The massive stone buildings looked completely different from the quiet shapes they had been beneath moonlight only a short time earlier. Priests opened great wooden doors. Courtyards gradually filled with movement. Sacred rituals began according to traditions preserved across generations. Incense drifted upward in thin streams. Soft prayers echoed beneath towering columns. Even here, the morning unfolded with calm order rather than excitement. Outside the temples, ordinary life continued almost unnoticed. A merchant arranged woven baskets before his small stall. Clay jars stood in neat rows. Bundles of onions, fresh herbs, dried fish, simple sandals, copper tools. Nothing luxurious. Only the practical goods needed by neighboring families. Customers would arrive gradually. Few people hurried. The day was long. There would be enough time for buying, selling, talking, and returning home before darkness arrived once again. The marketplace itself slowly awakened like the village before it. Voices became slightly louder. Donkeys carried fresh goods through narrow streets. Dust rose gently beneath many footsteps. The smell of bread mixed with fresh vegetables, warm earth, and smoke from cooking fires. Children laughed briefly before returning to chores. Somewhere a potter's wheel began turning. Nearby a blacksmith gently struck bronze with measured blows. No sound overwhelmed the others. Together they formed the peaceful music of another ordinary Egyptian morning. The sun continued rising. Shadows shortened. The cool breeze gradually softened beneath growing warmth. People wrapped light linen more closely around themselves as they prepared for another long day beneath the bright Egyptian sky. Yet even as daylight strengthened, the memory of the night's darkness remained close. Everyone knew that evening would eventually return. The lamps would be lit once more. The stars would again spread across the heavens. Families would gather inside quiet homes. The Nile would continue whispering beneath moonlight. And after another day of honest work, the ancient land would once again settle gently into the deep, peaceful darkness that had embraced it for thousands of years. By the time the sun had climbed well above the eastern horizon, the cool comfort of dawn had quietly slipped away. A gentle warmth settled across the Nile Valley first, almost unnoticed. Then, little by little, the warmth became steady heat. Before long, the familiar Egyptian sun shone brightly over fields, villages, temples, workshops, and winding canals. For the people of ancient Egypt, this change came every day. No one was surprised by it. They simply adjusted their lives to its slow and dependable rhythm. The morning became the busiest part of the day because everyone understood what the afternoon would bring. The longer the sun remained overhead, the heavier each task would feel. Arms would tire more quickly. Sandals would grow dusty. Linen clothing would cling to warm skin. Even speaking too much could seem like unnecessary work beneath the blazing sky. Along one irrigation canal, several farmers stood ankle-deep in cool water. The canal carried life itself. Without these carefully maintained waterways, the rich fields beside the Nile would soon become dry and unproductive. Every season required endless attention. Mud gathered along the edges. Reeds grew where they were not wanted. Small walls of packed earth sometimes cracked beneath the pressure of flowing water. The farmers worked quietly. Wooden shovels lifted wet soil. Hands pressed fresh mud into weak places. Feet sank softly into the cool banks. The water moved past them without hurry, reflecting the bright blue sky above. One young boy worked beside his father. He was not yet strong enough to carry heavy baskets, but he could remove stones from the channel and smooth loose earth with his hands. Every small task mattered. His father rarely explained every lesson aloud. Instead, the boy learned by watching. He noticed how carefully the older men judged the flow of water. Too much could flood a field. Too little could leave young plants thirsty. Balance required experience. Experience required time. There were no shortcuts. Nearby, rows of barley moved gently in the breeze. The golden heads of grain nodded together like quiet waves upon a peaceful sea. Dragonflies hovered above the canals, their wings catching tiny flashes of sunlight before disappearing again among the reeds. A pair of white herons landed nearby. They walked with remarkable patience, taking slow steps through the shallow water while searching for small fish and insects. The farmers hardly looked up. These birds had always been there. They belonged to the river just as surely as the reeds, the mud, and the flowing water. Farther along the Nile, fishermen continued their morning work. Their boats drifted quietly with the current while long nets spread across the water. Each movement appeared slow and deliberate. One man pulled carefully upon a rope. Another gathered the net into neat folds. Drops of river water sparkled briefly before falling back into the Nile. Sometimes the catch was generous. Sometimes only a few fish waded inside the woven net. Either way, the work continued. Fishing demanded patience more than excitement. The river decided each day's reward. The fishermen accepted this with calm understanding. Back in the village, the smell of baking bread still floated through narrow streets. Several women had been working since before dawn, and now fresh loaves rested upon woven baskets, slowly cooling in the warm air. Children carried some of the bread to nearby relatives. Others took loaves toward the marketplace. A few remained at home for the family's midday meal. The ovens themselves were simple but effective. Built from clay and hardened by countless fires, they held heat long after the flames had settled into glowing coals. The women understood these ovens almost as well as they understood the changing seasons. They knew exactly when the dough had risen enough. Exactly when the fire burned too hot. Exactly when a loaf needed another few moments before being removed. These skills had passed quietly from mother to daughter across generations. No written instructions were needed. Memory was enough. Across the village square, a potter sat before his wheel. His hands rested upon cool, damp clay. The wheel turned slowly beneath steady pressure. With every gentle movement, an ordinary lump of earth began changing shape. First a wide bowl. Then a narrow neck. Then a graceful rim. The clay responded almost as though it already knew what it wished to become. Years of practice guided the potter's fingers. Tiny adjustments made all the difference. Too much pressure would collapse the vessel. Too little would leave uneven walls. Nearby, rows of finished jars stood drying beneath the morning sun. Some would carry grain. Others would hold beer, water, oil, or wine. Simple objects. Yet every household depended upon them. Inside another workshop, weavers worked patiently before upright looms. Long strands of linen stretched tightly between wooden beams. Hands moved back and forth in gentle rhythm. Thread crossed thread. Pattern followed pattern. The sound was soft. Wood touching wood. Fibers sliding together. Occasional quiet conversation. The work demanded long hours but rewarded careful attention. Fine linen became one of Egypt's most valued products. The cloth felt light against the skin, making it especially welcome beneath the relentless summer heat. Even so, weaving required endurance. Shoulders stiffened. Fingers grew tired. Eyes remained fixed upon countless tiny threads. The day passed one careful movement at a time. Elsewhere, a young scribe sat cross-legged inside the shaded corner of a government storehouse. Unlike many workers laboring beneath the open sky, he spent much of his day recording numbers. How many sacks of grain had arrived? How many jars of oil had been delivered? Which families owed taxes? Which workers had completed assigned labor? His tools were simple. A wooden pallet. Small cakes of black and red ink. Brushes made from reeds. Sheets of carefully prepared papyrus. The room remained cooler than the open fields, yet concentration brought its own kind of exhaustion. His eyes followed row after row of careful symbols. Every mark mattered. A small mistake could confuse an entire account. The scribe paused occasionally to rest his fingers. Outside, sunlight brightened the courtyard. Dust floated gently through narrow beams of light entering the doorway. He listened to distant voices drifting in from nearby streets. Merchants bargaining. Donkeys braying softly. Children laughing for a brief moment before returning to chores. Life continued beyond the quiet room. The village never truly stood still. At the edge of the settlement, builders worked upon a modest new home. The walls rose slowly from sun-dried mud bricks. Each brick had once been little more than wet mud mixed with chopped straw. Workers had shaped them by hand and left them beneath the hot Egyptian sun until they hardened. Now those same bricks formed strong walls that might shelter one family for many years. The builders passed each brick carefully from one pair of hands to another. Mud mortar filled small gaps. Wooden beams waited nearby for the roof. No one hurried. A wall built too quickly might later crack. Steady work lasted longer. The builders understood this well. Their muscles carried the memory of countless similar projects. Above them, the sky remained cloudless. The bright blue stretched from one horizon to the other. Shade became precious. Whenever possible, workers paused beneath palm trees or beside high walls during the hottest part of the afternoon. Even the animals sought relief. Goats gathered beneath scattered trees. Dogs rested quietly against cool mud brick walls. Donkeys lowered their heads while standing almost perfectly still. The entire village seemed to breathe more slowly beneath the weight of the sun. Inside many homes, midday meals were simple and comforting. Bread remained the center of nearly every table. Alongside it might be lentils, onions, cucumbers, dates, or dried fish prepared earlier in the season. Fresh water stood inside cool clay jars. The porous walls of the pottery allowed tiny amounts of moisture to evaporate, helping keep the water pleasantly cool. Families appreciated every refreshing drink. The afternoon heat often left mouths dry after hours of labor. Children returned briefly from small tasks to eat with parents or grandparents. Conversations remained gentle. People spoke about crops that seemed healthy. Neighbors expecting new children. A broken fishing net needing repair. An elderly relative whose knees had become stiff. Ordinary topics filled ordinary lives. History often remembers rulers. Yet most days belonged to families like these. Not far away, a grandmother sat weaving a simple basket from fresh reeds gathered beside the Nile. Her fingers moved almost without conscious thought. Over. Under. Around. Tighten. Repeat. The pattern had become part of her long ago. Beside her sat her youngest granddaughter, watching every movement with careful eyes. The little girl occasionally reached toward the growing basket, gently touching the smooth reeds before smiling quietly. No formal lesson had begun. None was needed. Simply sitting together allowed knowledge to pass from one generation to the next. The afternoon breeze arrived slowly from the river. It carried the pleasant scent of damp earth mixed with growing plants. Palm leaves rustled overhead. Somewhere nearby, pigeons fluttered across a rooftop before settling again. The sounds blended into a peaceful rhythm that surrounded the village every day. A merchant leading 2 donkeys approached from the south. The animals carried woven baskets filled with pottery collected from another settlement. Dust covered the merchant's sandals. His face showed the gentle tiredness that comes after many hours beneath the sun. When he reached the village square, he greeted familiar faces with warm smiles. Trade in ancient Egypt was often built upon relationships that lasted many years. People remembered one another. They recognized voices. They knew whose pottery rarely cracked, whose grain remained dry, whose cloth was especially fine. Trust grew slowly. Like nearly everything else in this land. The merchant offered several new jars in exchange for grain and dried dates. No loud arguments followed. The discussion remained patient. Each side understood the value of careful fairness. Eventually both seemed satisfied. The donkeys rested while fresh cargo replaced the old. Soon they would continue north along another dusty road. As afternoon stretched onward, shadows slowly lengthened once again. The harsh brightness softened little by little. Workers glanced occasionally toward the western sky. The hardest hours were nearly behind them. Children noticed the change first. Their energy quietly returned as the heat eased. Women finished washing clothing beside the river. Builders stacked unused bricks. Farmers checked irrigation gates one final time before preparing to leave the fields. Every task naturally moved toward its evening pause. The village did not suddenly stop working. Instead, activity slowed as gently as the river itself. Along the Nile, fishermen returned with the day's catch. Boats touched muddy banks with quiet splashes. Nets were spread carefully across wooden poles to dry. Fish were sorted according to size. Some would be eaten immediately. Others would be salted or dried for future meals. The work continued calmly even as the sunlight became warmer and more golden. Nearby, children eagerly watched the returning boats. Sometimes a father lifted a small child aboard for just a moment. Tiny hands explored rough wooden planks polished smooth by years upon the river. The children imagined themselves steering boats one day. Learning had already begun. The evening breeze strengthened slightly. Dust settled. Palm trees swayed with slow, graceful movements. Birdsong changed as flocks prepared for another peaceful night. The western desert glowed with soft shades of gold and amber beneath the lowering sun. No one needed to ask what came next. Everyone already knew. Soon the lamps would be filled with fresh oil. Bread would be shared once more. Families would gather inside cool mud brick homes. The last daylight would quietly disappear beyond the desert hills. And with it, ancient Egypt would gently return to the deep and comforting darkness that had shaped every life beside the timeless waters of the Nile. As the sun lowered toward the western desert, the fierce brightness of the afternoon slowly softened into a warmer and gentler light. The Nile Valley seemed to breathe more easily. Heat still lingered in the earth and in the thick mud brick walls of the houses, but the worst of the day's burden had passed. Long shadows stretched across fields, canals, rooftops, and dusty paths, and people began turning their attention toward evening. This was one of the most welcome hours of the day. Farmers left the fields in small groups. Their tools rested across their shoulders. Their sandals carried traces of wet soil from the irrigation channels. Some spoke quietly about the condition of the crops. Others simply walked in comfortable silence, tired from many hours beneath the sun. The fields behind them remained peaceful. Barley swayed gently in the evening breeze. Palm trees cast long dark shapes across the ground. Water continued moving through the canals with the same steady patience it had shown all day. A pair of oxen stood near a wooden plow, resting before tomorrow's work would begin again. Along the riverbank, fishermen secured their boats for the night. Ropes were checked carefully. Nets were folded and hung where they could dry properly. The smell of fresh fish mixed with the cool scent of the Nile. One fisherman sat upon an overturned basket and stretched his aching back. His hands were rough from years of pulling wet rope. His face carried fine lines shaped by sunlight and wind. For a few quiet moments he simply watched the river. The water reflected the changing sky in soft bands of gold, copper, and pale blue. Birds crossed overhead in small flocks, returning to their resting places among the reeds. Nothing hurried them. Back in the village, evening preparations had already begun. Women swept courtyards and doorways, brushing away the dust that had gathered during the day. Clay jars were filled with fresh water for the night. Small cooking fires were lit once more, and thin streams of smoke drifted upward into the warm air. The smell of bread returned. So did the scent of onions, lentils, herbs, and fish cooking over low flames. Children carried bundles of firewood from nearby storage areas. Some helped grind grain for tomorrow morning. Others fetched small bowls, cups, and baskets for the evening meal. These chores were ordinary, yet they gave shape to every day. A child learned responsibility by repeating them again and again. An elderly grandmother sat near a doorway mending a linen garment whose seams had begun to wear thin. Her needle moved slowly through the fabric while the last sunlight touched her hands. Beside her, two younger children traced patterns in the dust with their fingers. They spoke softly. Even their play seemed gentler as evening approached. Nearby, a merchant closed his stall for the day. Unsold goods were covered carefully with woven cloth. Clay jars were moved inside. Baskets of vegetables were checked for spoilage. A simple wooden door was fastened across the front of the stall. Tomorrow the market would open again, and the same familiar faces would return to buy, sell, and exchange news. For now, work could rest. The sky continued changing. Gold deepened into amber. Amber softened into rose. Rose faded gradually toward violet. The western desert glowed for a few brief moments as though it still held the memory of the sun. Many people paused to watch. Not because it was rare, but because it was beautiful. In a larger house near the center of the settlement, a scribe finished his final records before nightfall. He rolled his papyrus sheets carefully and tied them with linen cord. Ink cakes were placed back into their small wooden box. Brushes were cleaned and set aside to dry. Writing by lamplight was difficult and wasteful. The scribe preferred to stop while enough daylight remained to see clearly. He stepped outside and rubbed his tired eyes. The evening air felt pleasant against his face. Across the village, temple attendants moved quietly through a stone courtyard preparing sacred lamps. Small flames were lit one by one before statues and shrines. The flickering light reflected softly from painted walls and polished stone. Even in the great temples, night was approaching. Priests lowered their voices. Footsteps echoed gently beneath tall columns. The vast spaces that had been bright and busy during the day gradually became calm and shadowed. As darkness gathered, families began to eat. Inside one modest home, bread was broken and shared among parents, children, and grandparents. A bowl of lentils sat at the center of the meal beside onions and a few dates. The lamp nearby gave only a small circle of light. Beyond it, the corners of the room were already fading into shadow. The family did not seem to mind. They leaned closer together. Conversation became quieter. The father spoke about a canal that would need repair next week. The mother mentioned grain that should be dried tomorrow if the weather remained clear. A grandmother reminded the children to stay close to the village after dark. The children listened while chewing slowly. These were not grand discussions. They were the simple threads that held ordinary lives together. Outside, the village grew steadily darker. One by one, lamps appeared in doorways and windows. Tiny flames flickered against mud brick walls like small stars brought down to earth. Yet even with all the lamps burning, the darkness remained powerful. Most homes could illuminate only a single room. A few wealthy households might light several spaces, but the majority of Egyptians lived within modest pools of golden light surrounded by deep shadow. This was why ancient nights felt so dark. The darkness was not pushed away. It simply waited beyond the reach of every flame. A traveler entering the village after sunset would see only scattered lights floating in a sea of blackness. The paths between houses might vanish completely where no lamp happened to shine. People moved carefully. They knew where stones lay, where ditches crossed the road, where animals were tied for the night. Memory guided them as much as sight. Above the village, the first stars began to appear. A bright point emerged in the eastern sky. Then another. Then dozens more. Children often noticed them before adults did. One small boy pointed upward excitedly, and his sister lifted her face to search for the growing patterns overhead. Soon the sky filled with stars so numerous that counting them became impossible. The Milky Way stretched across the heavens in a pale shimmering band. Without smoke from factories, without electric light, without bright cities glowing beyond the horizon, the night sky revealed itself in extraordinary detail. Every season brought familiar arrangements. Farmers watched for stars connected with planting and flooding. Boatmen used them while traveling before dawn. Priests observed them for religious calendars. Ordinary families simply lived beneath them night after night. Along the Nile, moonlight had not yet risen. The river looked dark and mysterious, its surface broken only by faint reflections of the stars. Frogs called from hidden reeds. Insects sang in steady rhythms that seemed to continue forever. A fisherman sleeping beside his boat turned once beneath a linen blanket and settled again into deeper rest. Tomorrow would begin before sunrise. Elsewhere, a night guard walked slowly along the wall of a grain storehouse. Close your eyes for a little while and imagine a small lamp whose flame trembled whenever the breeze touched it. His ears remained alert. The soft step of his own sandals. The rustle of reeds. The distant bark of a dog. A donkey shifting its weight nearby. These sounds were ordinary. Anything different would stand out immediately in the quiet. Most nights passed peacefully. The grain remained safe. The guard continued his slow circuit beneath the stars. On a rooftop nearby, several family members lingered before sleep. The air was cooler there than inside the house below. They sat upon woven mats while looking across the darkened village. From this height they could see scattered lamps glowing in distant homes. Beyond the settlement lay fields that had almost disappeared into darkness. Farther still, the desert stretched away unseen beneath the night sky. One elderly man spoke softly about floods he remembered from many years ago. The younger listeners remained quiet. Stories often belonged to the evening. Night seemed to make memories easier to share. Eventually the youngest children grew sleepy. They were carried downstairs or guided gently to their sleeping mats. One by one, the remaining family members prepared for rest. A woman checked the water jars. A man secured the doorway. The lamp flame was turned lower to save oil. Finally, after a last quiet exchange of words, the wick was pinched between damp fingers. The room disappeared into darkness. Not dimness. Not shadow. True darkness. Only a faint line of starlight entered through a small opening near the roof. The family settled onto woven mats and linen blankets. Outside, the village became almost silent. A few lamps still burned in distant houses. A temple flame flickered far away. The night guard continued his patient walk. But most people were asleep. The stars wheeled slowly overhead. Hours passed. The moon finally rose above the eastern horizon, silver and calm. Its light spread across rooftops, palm leaves, temple walls, and the quiet waters of the Nile. Shadows softened. Paths became visible again. Ancient Egypt rested beneath that pale light, wrapped in a darkness far deeper than most people today ever experience. And in that darkness, millions of ordinary lives found rest, comfort, and the gentle promise that dawn would come again. The moon climbed higher into the night, slowly lifting itself above the eastern hills until its pale light spread across the Nile Valley. The silver glow never reached the strength of the daytime sun. It did not chase away the darkness. Instead, it rested gently upon the land, softening the edges of rooftops, palm trees, quiet canals, and distant temple walls. The world looked different beneath the moon. Familiar paths became gentle ribbons of pale earth. The river reflected long streams of silver that trembled with every ripple. Mud brick homes appeared almost blue beneath the cool light. Palm leaves shimmered whenever the breeze passed through them. Everything seemed slower. Even time itself appeared to move with greater patience. Most of the village remained asleep. The long day of labor had left nearly every family deeply tired. Builders who had carried heavy stone all afternoon rested beside wives who had spent endless hours grinding grain. Fishermen slept with sore shoulders after hauling wet nets from the Nile. Children who had helped sweep courtyards, carry water, or gather firewood dreamed quietly beneath simple linen coverings. The silence was never complete. Ancient Egypt was full of gentle nighttime sounds. A donkey shifted its weight inside a small enclosure, its rope brushing softly against a wooden post. Goats settled together, occasionally making quiet noises before returning to sleep. Somewhere nearby, a dog lifted its head, listened for a moment, then lowered it once again onto the cool earth. These familiar sounds comforted people who had heard them every night since childhood. Far beyond the village, the desert remained awake. The great stretches of sand, so harsh beneath the afternoon sun, became calm beneath the moonlight. The heat stored during the day slowly escaped into the cool night air. Small desert animals emerged from hiding. A fox padded quietly across the sand, leaving delicate footprints that the morning wind might erase before anyone noticed them. A desert owl rested silently upon a weathered stone, watching the ground below with patient eyes. Tiny insects moved among dry shrubs that had survived another hot day. Few villagers ever saw these quiet creatures. Yet they shared the same night. The darkness belonged to all living things. Near the edge of the Nile, thick reeds swayed gently. Their long stems whispered together whenever the breeze moved across the water. Frogs continued calling from hidden places along the muddy banks. Fish disturbed the smooth surface from time to time, creating circles that slowly widened before disappearing once more. A lone boat rocked gently against its mooring rope. The wood creaked softly. Its owner slept only a short distance away. He trusted the river. He had spent nearly every day of his life upon its waters. He understood its moods. He knew where the currents flowed most strongly. He recognized the changing color of the water before floods. He listened to the river almost the way another person might listen to an old friend. Inside a nearby home, a small child stirred during the night. The room was almost completely dark. Only faint moonlight entered through a narrow opening high in the wall. The child listened for a moment. He heard his father's slow breathing, his mother's quiet sigh, the distant insects outside. Comfort surrounded him. Without opening his eyes fully, he settled back beneath his linen blanket. Sleep returned almost immediately. For many Egyptian families, nights followed familiar patterns like these. People occasionally woke for a brief moment. Perhaps to drink cool water from a clay jar. Perhaps to check on a young child. Perhaps because the breeze shifted through the doorway. Then they quietly returned to sleep. The village itself remained wrapped in darkness. Only a few small lights continued burning. One came from a temple where attendants cared for sacred flames through the night. Another glowed from the home of an elderly woman whose lamp burned low while she watched over a sick family member. Farther away, a guard carried a tiny oil lamp as he continued walking beside storehouses filled with grain. These scattered lights seemed almost fragile beneath the vast night sky. The stars still filled the heavens. Some shone brightly enough to cast the faintest suggestion of shadow across open ground. Others appeared like tiny grains of silver dust stretching from one horizon to the other. The Milky Way remained clear above the desert. Children who had fallen asleep while looking upward from rooftops had watched those same stars only a few hours earlier. Now they dreamed beneath them. Many ancient Egyptians believed the sky held deep meaning. The heavens were not simply empty space. They reflected order, rhythm, and the steady passage of time. Priests carefully observed certain stars that marked important moments during the year. Farmers watched for signs connected with the flooding of the Nile. Boatmen trusted familiar constellations when traveling before dawn. Even those who knew little about astronomy found comfort in seeing the same bright patterns appear night after night. The stars were dependable. Much like the river. Much like sunrise. Much like the changing seasons. Hours continued slipping quietly past. The moon reached its highest point. Its cool light spread across great temple complexes built from enormous blocks of stone. During the day, these places echoed with footsteps, voices, prayers, and the movement of workers. Now they stood almost completely still. Massive columns rose like silent forests of carved stone. Statues cast long shadows across empty courtyards. Painted walls faded gently into darkness. Even the grandest buildings seemed peaceful at this hour. Their silence felt ancient. Far beyond one temple, an unfinished building rested beneath the moonlight. Stacks of limestone waited where workers had left them before sunset. Wooden sledges stood quietly beside the stone blocks. Ropes lay neatly coiled upon the ground. Tomorrow morning dozens of laborers would return. They would lift, pull, measure, shape, carry. But tonight every tool rested. Even hard work needed sleep. In another part of the village, an elderly potter woke briefly. Years of early mornings had trained his body to rise before dawn, and sometimes he awoke long before the sky had begun to brighten. He sat quietly for a few moments outside his home. The air felt wonderfully cool compared with the afternoon. He looked toward the river. Moonlight rested upon the water like polished silver. He smiled softly. He had seen this view thousands of times. Yet it never seemed exactly the same. Sometimes mist floated above the Nile. Sometimes the moon appeared larger. Sometimes the breeze carried the scent of flowering plants growing beside nearby canals. Every night offered small differences. None needed to be remarkable. Their quiet beauty was enough. After drinking a little water from a clay cup, he returned inside. His pottery wheel would wait until daylight. There was no reason to hurry. Night belonged to rest. Throughout ancient Egypt, this simple understanding shaped everyday life. Darkness encouraged people to stop working. Oil was too valuable to waste. Eyes became tired beneath weak lamplight. The body itself asked for sleep after hours of labor beneath the relentless sun. Without realizing it, people lived in close harmony with the natural rhythm of daylight and darkness. Morning invited movement. Afternoon demanded endurance. Evening welcomed family. Night offered recovery. Then the cycle quietly began again. Near one small house, a grandmother dreamed of her childhood village farther upriver. She remembered running barefoot along muddy banks, watching her own mother bake bread before sunrise, listening to stories told beneath the stars. Many years had passed since then. Friends had grown old. Children had become parents. Grandchildren now played in the same dusty streets where she once played herself. The rhythm of life continued. Generation after generation. Much remained unchanged. The Nile still flooded. The crops still grew. The stars still crossed the heavens. Morning still followed every night. Before long, the eastern edge of the sky began changing almost too slowly to notice. At first the darkness remained complete. Then a faint softness appeared low above the distant horizon. Not sunlight. Only the earliest suggestion that morning was quietly approaching. The brightest stars began losing some of their sharpness. They still shone clearly overhead, yet those closest to the horizon slowly faded into the growing light. A cool breeze drifted across the fields. Palm leaves rustled gently. The frogs became quieter. Birds had not yet begun their morning songs, but somewhere deep within the reeds, the first signs of waking life were already beginning. The Nile continued its endless journey northward, flowing through sleeping villages, silent temples, fertile farmland, and quiet stretches of open riverbank. It had carried countless generations before these families. It would carry countless more after them. Tonight, like every night, it flowed without hurry. Its gentle current whispered against muddy shores while ancient Egypt rested beneath the fading stars, wrapped in a darkness so deep, so natural, and so familiar that it felt as timeless as the river itself. The first gentle light of morning gathered slowly along the eastern horizon. It did not arrive all at once. Instead, it spread little by little across the edge of the desert, soft enough that many sleeping people never noticed the exact moment when night began to loosen its hold. The stars still remained overhead. The brightest ones lingered patiently in the fading darkness, while smaller stars quietly disappeared into the growing blue of the sky. For a short while, both night and morning seemed to share the world together. The moon, now lower in the western sky, looked pale and tired. Its bright silver glow had softened, almost as though it understood that its work was nearly finished. The Nile reflected both the moon above and the first light of dawn at the same time. The river seemed to carry two skies upon its surface. A cool mist drifted above the water. It moved so gently that it almost appeared to stand still. The reeds along the banks wore tiny drops of moisture that caught the earliest light. Every blade of grass, every broad leaf, every small flower growing close to the water seemed refreshed after the long, quiet night. Before the village fully awakened, a few familiar figures were already moving through the stillness. The oldest baker stepped outside his home carrying a small bundle of dry reeds beneath one arm. His family had baked bread for many years. Every morning began in almost exactly the same way. He knelt beside the clay oven. Carefully, he arranged the reeds. A few small pieces of dry wood followed. Then he struck flint against stone until a tiny spark found its place. The first thin ribbon of smoke rose into the cool air. The fire was small at first. It needed patience. Like so many things in ancient Egypt, rushing would only make the task more difficult. Soon the flames grew stronger. The familiar smell of burning wood drifted quietly through the narrow streets. Not far away, another family was already awake. The mother tied back her long hair before lifting a heavy grinding stone into position. Beside her sat a basket filled with grain harvested weeks before. She poured a small amount beneath the stone. Then the steady movement began. Forward. Back. Forward. Back. The rhythm hardly changed. The sound was soft and steady. Stone sliding across grain. Grain becoming flour. The work would continue for much of the morning. Nearby, her eldest daughter prepared clay bowls while her younger son fetched water from yesterday's supply. Even before sunrise, every member of the household had a place within the quiet routine. Outside, a rooster announced the coming day. Its call echoed across the village. Other birds answered from nearby rooftops and palm trees. Soon the peaceful silence of the night slowly transformed into the gentle sounds of morning. Doves fluttered from roof to roof. Small songbirds searched for seeds near garden walls. Herons lifted gracefully from the reeds beside the Nile. The valley awakened without hurry. The sunlight had not yet reached the village itself. The eastern sky simply became brighter with every passing moment. At the edge of the settlement, an elderly farmer stood alone beside his field. He often came before the others. Not because extra work was expected. Because he enjoyed these quiet moments before the day's labor truly began. He rested both hands upon his wooden staff. The cool earth felt pleasant beneath his sandals. He watched the mist floating above the irrigation channels. The water moved slowly through carefully shaped banks that generations of farmers had maintained. His father had once worked these same fields. His grandfather before him. Perhaps even older ancestors whose names had long since faded from memory. The land remained. People came and went. The Nile continued flowing. The crops continued growing. Morning continued arriving. The farmer smiled quietly. There was comfort in such dependable rhythms. Nearby, a pair of young brothers carried empty baskets toward a small vegetable garden. One basket was slightly larger than the other. The younger boy struggled to balance his load, though it contained almost nothing yet. His older brother slowed his own pace without being asked. Together they walked beneath rows of date palms. They said very little. Morning seemed to encourage peaceful silence. Soon they reached the garden. The vegetables still carried drops of moisture from the cool night air. The boys carefully gathered onions, lettuce, and herbs while trying not to disturb the tender leaves around them. Each vegetable would later appear in the family meal. Simple work. Important work. Not far from the fields, fishermen untied their boats once again. Morning after morning, the same quiet ritual unfolded. One man checked the woven ropes. Another folded fresh nets. A third carefully arranged clay jars that would hold drinking water throughout the day. The boats drifted gently against the riverbank while they prepared. The Nile itself seemed almost eager to welcome them back. Its current remained steady. Its surface reflected the brightening sky. Tiny fish disturbed the calm water now and then, creating circles that spread outward before fading away. One young fisherman paused for a moment before climbing aboard. He looked toward the east. The first edge of the sun had just appeared above the distant horizon. Golden light spread slowly across the fields. Palm trees glowed softly. Temple walls caught the earliest rays. The cool blue colors of dawn gradually gave way to warm shades of gold. Day had returned. Across the village, doors opened one after another. People stepped outside carrying tools, baskets, ropes, and water jars. Children rubbed sleep from their eyes while helping parents prepare for another day. An old donkey stretched its neck before accepting a familiar load across its back. Goats wandered from their small pens. Even the village dogs rose slowly, shaking dust from their fur before searching for comfortable places to rest in the coming shade. The marketplace also began to awaken. Merchants arrived carrying woven baskets balanced upon their shoulders. Fresh vegetables, dates, clay pots, bundles of flax, fish caught the previous evening. Everything found its place. Wooden stalls were uncovered. Simple cloth awnings stretched overhead. The square slowly filled with the peaceful sounds of another ordinary day beginning. A potter passed by pushing a small cart loaded with newly fired bowls. He moved carefully. Each piece represented many hours of patient work. Digging clay beside the river. Mixing it with water. Shaping it upon the wheel. Drying it beneath the sun. Firing it inside the kiln. One careless bump might undo days of effort. He smiled politely as neighbors greeted him. The village was not large. Most faces were familiar. Names passed easily between friends who had known one another for years. Inside the carpenter's workshop, beams of early sunlight entered through the doorway. The smell of fresh cut wood still lingered from yesterday's work. The apprentice arrived first. As always, he swept away the previous day's wood shavings before arranging tools neatly upon a low bench. Bronze chisels, wooden mallets, measuring cords, bow drills. Everything waited quietly for the day's labor to begin. His master arrived soon afterward. Neither man spoke very much. There was no need. Their routine had become familiar through repetition. The first piece of cedar rested upon wooden supports. The gentle tapping of tools soon joined the growing sounds of the village. Elsewhere, weavers returned to their looms. The long threads stretched patiently where yesterday's work had ended. Hands found familiar positions. The shuttle passed back and forth. The rhythm returned almost immediately. The cloth slowly grew. Thread by thread. Hour by hour. Across the Nile Valley, thousands of similar mornings unfolded in villages large and small. Every family followed its own routine. Yet many shared the same quiet patterns. Bread baked before sunrise. Water carried from wells or the river. Fields tended before the strongest heat. Boats pushed gently onto calm water. Children learning beside parents. Grandparents watching younger generations continue traditions that had lasted for centuries. Very little happened quickly. Even change itself moved slowly. A new home might take many weeks to build. A child might spend years learning a trade. Palm trees required patience before giving fruit. Stone monuments rose little by little across decades. The Nile flooded according to its own ancient rhythm. Life encouraged steady effort instead of haste. As the morning grew brighter, the last memory of night slowly disappeared from the landscape. The stars had vanished. The moon faded into the pale western sky before quietly slipping from sight. The darkness that had covered Egypt only hours earlier now seemed almost impossible to imagine beneath the brilliant sunlight. Yet everyone knew it would return. As surely as the river flowed north. As surely as bread baked each morning. As surely as tired workers would eventually lay down their tools. The deep night waited patiently beyond the daylight, ready to wrap the Nile Valley in silence once again when another long day had gently come to its close. The sun continued its slow climb across the clear Egyptian sky, and with every passing hour the cool freshness of morning gently faded. The pleasant breeze that had drifted over the Nile became softer, almost as if it too wished to rest before the long afternoon. Shadows beneath palm trees grew shorter. The light upon the river brightened until it shimmered like polished glass. For the people of ancient Egypt, this was the beginning of another familiar day. There was comfort in that familiarity. Very little happened unexpectedly. The same paths were walked. The same fields were tended. The same ovens were warmed. The same boats drifted away from the riverbank. Each day quietly resembled the one before it, and there was a peaceful steadiness in that rhythm. Near one small farming village, a narrow path wound between irrigated fields and clusters of date palms. The ground had been packed firm by countless footsteps over many generations. Farmers, shepherds, merchants, children, and travelers had all followed the same route, wearing the earth smooth without ever intending to. A young woman walked along the path carrying two empty clay jars balanced across a wooden yoke resting upon her shoulders. She moved carefully. The jars knocked together with a soft hollow sound. Their weight was light now, but she knew the journey home would require slower steps once they were filled with water. She had walked this path since childhood. At first beside her mother. Later beside older sisters. Now often alone. The journey no longer required thought. Her feet knew every slight bend in the road. She knew where loose stones rested after heavy winds. She knew where shade lingered longest beneath the palms. She even knew which birds usually nested in certain trees each spring. As she approached the river, she found several other women already gathering water. Some knelt at the edge of the bank. Others waited patiently with empty jars beside them. Conversation rose and fell in gentle voices. No one seemed hurried. The Nile would continue flowing whether they rushed or not. One woman spoke quietly about her youngest son's first day helping in the fields. Another smiled while describing new sandals her husband had woven from papyrus fibers. An older woman remembered seasons when the flood waters had reached much farther across the valley. These conversations drifted as easily as the morning breeze. They were ordinary. Yet they connected neighbors through shared memories and familiar routines. The water itself looked calm. Sunlight reached deep enough to reveal waving plants beneath the surface near the shore. Tiny fish darted between them before disappearing into darker water farther out. The women dipped their jars carefully. Each clay vessel filled with a quiet bubbling sound. When lifted from the river, cool drops rolled down the smooth sides and darkened the dusty ground beneath. The return walk required patience. Water was precious. A single careless step might spill part of the morning's effort. Nearby, a pair of young boys searched the muddy riverbank for smooth stones. Neither spoke very much. One occasionally held up an interesting pebble for the other to examine. Most were returned to the ground after a thoughtful look. A few found places inside small woven pouches tied to their belts. Simple treasures. Nothing of great value. Yet they would be carried home with quiet pride. Not every important memory came from grand events. Many began with small moments beside the river. Farther downstream, a fisherman carefully repaired a section of torn net beneath the shade of a sycamore fig tree. The damage was not large. Only a few broken strands where the rope had caught against hidden branches beneath the water. Still, he understood the importance of careful repair. A small tear left unattended would slowly become larger. Eventually an entire day's catch might escape through that opening. His fingers moved steadily. Thread passed through woven fibers. Knots tightened one by one. He worked without frustration. This task had become as familiar as rowing his boat. Around him lay the quiet signs of his trade. Wooden floats carved years before. Clay weights worn smooth by water. Coiled rope resting neatly beside a reed basket. Everything had its place. Nothing was wasted. When a tool finally wore beyond repair, its useful pieces often found new purposes elsewhere. Wood became firewood. Rope became shorter cords. Broken pottery sometimes strengthened mud walls. Ancient Egyptian households learned to use nearly everything for as long as possible. In another part of the village, the smell of fresh linen drying in the sunlight drifted across a courtyard. Long strips of cloth hung from simple wooden poles, moving gently whenever the breeze passed through. Nearby, two sisters folded finished fabric while their mother inspected each piece. Fine linen required patience from beginning to end. Flax had first been planted in carefully prepared soil. Later harvested. Then soaked. Separated into fibers. Spun into thread. Finally woven into cloth. Each stage depended upon countless careful hands. The finished fabric felt light and cool against the skin. During Egypt's long summers, this simple comfort mattered greatly. The younger sister paused while folding. She looked upward. A pair of swallows darted across the bright blue sky, chasing insects above the rooftops. Within moments they were gone again. The cloth continued fluttering softly in the warm air. Across the village, the carpenter and his apprentice had nearly completed a sturdy wooden stool ordered by a neighboring family. The apprentice sanded each surface carefully using rough stone. His teacher examined every joint before nodding with quiet approval. Neither man celebrated the finished work. Good craftsmanship spoke for itself. The stool would likely remain inside the family's home for many years. Children might one day sit upon it while learning to weave baskets or grind grain. Visitors would rest upon it during evening conversations. Perhaps one day it would even pass to another generation. Simple objects often remained part of family life far longer than the people who first created them. Near the marketplace, the day's trade continued at an easy pace. Merchants shaded themselves beneath woven awnings while greeting familiar customers. There were no hurried crowds. People arrived gradually. One woman exchanged baskets of onions for cooking oil. A fisherman traded fresh fish for new rope. A potter accepted grain in return for several sturdy storage jars. Many exchanges happened without coins. Goods themselves carried value. Everyone understood approximately what was fair. Trust mattered as much as calculation. The marketplace also carried news. Someone had seen unusually large birds gathering near northern marshes. Another traveler reported that floodwaters farther south looked promising this year. An elderly merchant quietly mentioned that a neighboring village planned a small festival after the next harvest. The stories passed gently from one conversation to another. Not as exciting announcements. Simply as part of everyday life. Nearby, children played beneath the watchful eyes of older relatives. Their games required little. A smooth stick became a toy. A handful of pebbles became a challenge. Lines drawn in dust became imaginary roads, rivers, and fields. Their laughter rose briefly before fading once more into the steady sounds of the village. Even play followed the rhythm of the day. When parents called, the games ended without complaint. There was always work waiting. A small girl carried a basket of dates toward her grandmother's house. She walked slowly to avoid bruising the fruit. The dates smelled wonderfully sweet beneath the growing warmth. When she arrived, her grandmother smiled warmly before placing the fruit into a cool storage jar. Together they sat in the shaded doorway. The older woman began separating flax fibers while the child watched with quiet curiosity. She explained very little. Instead, she demonstrated each movement. Tiny hands soon tried to copy the work. The first attempts were uneven. The grandmother simply smiled again. Skill would come with time. Time was never considered an enemy. The hours continued passing beneath the bright Egyptian sun. Gradually the warmth became heavier. Dusty roads shimmered softly. Animals sought patches of shade. Even birds seemed to sing less often during the hottest part of the day. Workers adjusted naturally. Farmers paused for water beneath palm trees. Builders rested briefly before returning to their tasks. Merchants sat quietly while waiting for the next customer. No one expected endless energy. The climate itself encouraged moments of rest. Inside many homes, thick mud brick walls helped soften the heat. The rooms remained pleasantly cooler than the open streets outside. Clay water jars stood near doorways, their surfaces damp with tiny droplets that slowly cooled the water within. A mother poured a cup for her youngest son after he returned from carrying grain. He drank slowly. The coolness refreshed him immediately. Nearby, his grandfather repaired the handle of a worn wooden shovel. Nothing was discarded if it could still serve another season. As the afternoon quietly approached, life across the Nile Valley settled into a slower rhythm. The work continued, but each movement became more deliberate. Voices softened. Steps slowed. The bright sun watched over fields, workshops, temples, boats, and villages just as it had for countless generations before. And everyone knew, without needing to say it aloud, that when this long day finally came to its gentle end, darkness would once again spread across the land, bringing with it cool air, quiet stars, and the peaceful stillness that had always been one of ancient Egypt's oldest companions. The afternoon settled gently over the Nile Valley, and the sunlight became thick with warmth. It rested upon the stone walls of temples, upon the flat roofs of mud brick homes, upon the quiet canals, and upon the endless fields that stretched beside the river. Even the distant desert seemed to shimmer beneath the heat, its pale sand glowing beneath the cloudless sky. For many people, these were the slowest hours of the day. Morning had carried the greatest energy. Evening would bring welcome relief. The afternoon existed somewhere between them, asking everyone to work carefully, steadily, and without unnecessary haste. Near a broad field of ripening barley, several farmers continued their labor. Their linen clothing had become dusty from hours spent among the dry stalks. Sweat darkened the cloth around their shoulders and backs. Every movement required a little more effort than it had only a few hours earlier. Still, they continued. One man bent to pull weeds growing beside the young grain. Another inspected a small irrigation gate where water entered the field. A third carried a woven basket filled with simple tools that had been repaired many times over the years. The work was never dramatic. It was patient. Much of farming was simply paying attention. Looking closely. Noticing small changes. Feeling the soil between one's fingers. Watching the color of growing plants. Listening to the quiet sound of water moving through narrow channels. These small observations often mattered more than great strength. An older farmer knelt beside one canal and scooped a handful of wet earth into his palm. He rolled it gently between his fingers before letting it fall again. The moisture felt right. Not too dry. Not too soft. He nodded quietly to himself. The field would drink enough water today. Nearby, his grandson watched every movement. The boy said nothing. He simply observed. One day these quiet judgments would become part of his own life. Lessons often arrived without words. Farther along the river, a shepherd guided a small flock of goats toward an area where scattered shrubs still offered fresh leaves. The animals moved slowly beneath the afternoon sun. From time to time one wandered slightly away from the group, only to return after hearing the shepherd's calm voice. He knew each goat almost as well as people know old friends. Some were curious. Some were stubborn. Others preferred to remain close to the center of the flock. Years spent together had taught him these little differences. He carried only a simple wooden staff. It served many purposes. Walking stick. Guide. Protection. Tool. Its smooth surface had become polished by years of use. Nearby, a young dog trotted faithfully beside him, occasionally circling the flock before settling once more into an easy pace. The shepherd rarely hurried either the animals or himself. There was little reason to. The afternoon belonged to slow movement. In the village, many workshops had grown quieter. Inside the potter's yard, newly shaped vessels stood in neat rows beneath the sunlight. Large storage jars. Water pitchers. Cooking bowls. Small cups. Each one slowly dried before being placed into the kiln. The potter walked among them carefully. His experienced eyes noticed tiny imperfections invisible to others. A slightly uneven rim. A wall that had become too thin. A handle needing gentle adjustment. He corrected what he could while the clay still remained soft. The younger apprentice followed behind carrying a small bowl of water. Whenever the clay became too dry to shape easily, he dampened it with careful hands. His work seemed small. Yet without it, many fine pieces might crack before they were finished. Master and apprentice worked almost entirely in silence. Only the soft sound of birds and the distant voices from the marketplace reached their ears. Elsewhere, inside a shaded weaving room, several women continued making linen cloth. The room remained pleasantly cool because its thick walls kept much of the afternoon heat outside. Sunlight entered through narrow openings high above, creating long beams that slowly shifted across the floor. The looms stood in quiet rows. Wooden frames. Tightly stretched threads. Bundles of spun flax waiting nearby. The gentle rhythm continued. Thread passed over. Thread passed under. The shuttle crossed from one side to the other. The cloth grew almost without anyone noticing. One young woman quietly hummed an old melody her mother had sung many years before. It was not loud. Barely more than a whisper. Soon another woman softly joined her. The tune drifted through the room like the afternoon breeze. No performance. No audience. Simply a familiar song making long hours feel even gentler. Outside, children searched for shade beneath a cluster of sycamore trees. Their morning chores had been completed, and for a little while they enjoyed simple games together. One child carefully balanced smooth stones into a tiny tower. Another traced pictures into the dusty ground using a thin stick. A third gathered fallen palm leaves and pretended they were small boats sailing upon an imaginary river. Their laughter rose briefly before fading again. Even children seemed to understand that the hottest hours encouraged quieter play. An elderly grandfather watched them from nearby. He sat upon a low wooden stool, slowly repairing a fishing basket whose woven sides had begun to loosen. His fingers moved with practiced confidence. Each reed found its proper place. Each bend followed a pattern remembered across many decades. Occasionally one of the children wandered over to ask a question. He answered patiently, then returned to his work. No moment felt wasted. Time itself moved gently through the village. At the marketplace, activity slowed as well. Many merchants rested beneath woven awnings stretched between wooden poles. The shade provided welcome relief from the bright sunlight. Clay jars of cool water stood nearby. Customers continued arriving, though less frequently than during the busy morning. One merchant polished bronze tools with a soft cloth while waiting. Another carefully counted bundles of flax. A woman selling dates rearranged her basket simply to keep busy. No one complained about the slower pace. The heat belonged to everyone equally. Even the donkeys seemed grateful for rest. Several stood quietly beside loaded carts, their ears flicking lazily at insects. Their heavy work would continue later when the air became cooler. One young merchant gently rubbed the neck of his oldest donkey before offering it a small drink of water. The animal accepted gratefully. Years spent traveling dusty roads together had created a quiet understanding between them. They depended upon each other. The merchant carried goods. The donkey carried the weight. Along the Nile itself, boat traffic had nearly stopped for a little while. Many captains preferred waiting until later in the afternoon before continuing longer journeys. The river remained calm. Its surface reflected the bright sky so clearly that distant boats sometimes appeared to float between two worlds. Water birds rested among thick reeds. Dragonflies schemed across the surface, their delicate wings flashing whenever sunlight touched them. A turtle climbed onto a warm stone near the bank and remained perfectly still. Nothing disturbed the peaceful rhythm of the river. Inside one modest home, a young mother gently rocked her baby while sitting near the coolest wall of the house. The child had grown sleepy after the morning's activity. Outside, faint sounds drifted through the doorway. The distant tapping of a carpenter. The low voices of passing neighbors. The fluttering wings of pigeons settling upon nearby rooftops. She listened without really thinking about each sound. Together they formed the familiar music of home. Her older daughter sat beside her grandmother, carefully learning how to braid papyrus fibers into thin cord. The work demanded patience. Several early attempts became uneven. The grandmother smiled kindly. She loosened the fibers. Then showed the movements once again. Slowly. Carefully. The little girl's hands followed. This time the cord held together. She smiled proudly. The grandmother nodded with quiet approval. No grand celebration followed. Only another lesson gently becoming part of everyday life. As the afternoon slowly continued, shadows began almost unnoticed to grow a little longer. The fierce brightness softened ever so slightly. Workers glanced toward the western sky without realizing they were doing so. They knew evening would eventually arrive. With it would come cooler air. Cooking fires. Family meals. The lighting of oil lamps. The first bright stars appearing overhead. For now, however, there was still work to finish. A builder carefully placed the final mud brick into a low garden wall before smoothing fresh mortar with his hand. A fisherman checked tomorrow's nets one more time. A scribe completed the last lines upon a sheet of papyrus before cleaning his brush. A woman filled several storage jars with newly ground flour. A child gathered scattered pieces of firewood before carrying them inside. One by one, the countless ordinary tasks of the day quietly reached completion. No single action seemed important by itself. Yet together they formed the steady heartbeat of ancient Egypt. Kings might build monuments. Priests might perform sacred ceremonies. But it was the patient work of ordinary people, farmers, fishermen, bakers, potters, weavers, builders, servants, merchants, and families that carried the rhythm of life from one sunrise to the next. And as the golden afternoon slowly drifted toward evening, the land itself seemed to relax, waiting once again for the welcome return of cool air, deep shadows, and another peaceful Egyptian night. The afternoon slowly began to loosen its hold on the Nile Valley. It happened so gently that no one could point to the exact moment when the day started changing. The sun still shone brightly, but its light became softer. The shadows beside walls, palm trees, and irrigation canals quietly stretched across the earth once more. A light breeze returned from the river. It carried the pleasant scent of damp reeds and cool water, slipping through village streets before wandering into open fields. After many hours beneath the warm sun, even the smallest breath of moving air felt welcome. Farmers noticed it first. A man straightened his back after working among the barley. He rested both hands upon the handle of his wooden hoe and closed his eyes for only a moment as the breeze passed across his face. The relief was simple. No celebration. No loud words. Just one quiet breath after another. Around him, others continued their work with the same calm rhythm they had followed since dawn. A young woman gathered bundles of flax that had been drying beneath the afternoon sun. She tied each bundle carefully with strips of woven fiber before placing them inside a reed basket. Every movement had become familiar through years of practice. She no longer needed to think about each step. Her hands remembered. Nearby, her younger brother followed behind, collecting the few loose stems left upon the ground. Neither hurried. The daylight would remain for several more hours. There was enough time. Across another field, two oxen slowly pulled a wooden sled loaded with freshly cut reeds. The animals moved with patient strength. Their steady pace never changed. The farmer walking beside them carried no whip. Instead, he spoke quietly whenever they reached uneven ground. The oxen recognized his voice. Together they had worked through many growing seasons. Trust had grown between them little by little, one ordinary day after another. The wooden sled left shallow tracks in the dusty earth. Tomorrow the wind might soften those marks. Within a few days they would disappear completely. So much of ordinary life left only small traces behind. At the edge of the village, several children walked toward the river carrying empty woven baskets. Their task was simple. They would gather fallen reeds and dry branches washed onto the riverbank. These would later become cooking fuel. The youngest child occasionally stopped to watch dragonflies hovering above the canals. Their transparent wings shimmered whenever sunlight reached them. One older sister gently called him forward. There would be time to look. But first there was work to finish. The children smiled and continued together. When they reached the riverbank, they spread out quietly. One searched among clusters of reeds. Another picked up pieces of driftwood carried by earlier floods. A third discovered several smooth shells resting near the water's edge. She held one up to admire its gentle shape before carefully placing it inside her basket beside the firewood. Small discoveries often became treasured memories. The Nile offered something new each day, even if those changes were tiny. Not far away, a fisherman sat repairing the handle of a wooden oar. Years of steady use had worn smooth places where his hands always rested. The wood carried small scratches collected from countless journeys along the river. He rubbed fresh oil into the handle using a cloth woven from old linen. The wood slowly drank in the oil. Its color deepened. The oar looked ready for many more mornings upon the water. Nearby, his eldest son watched carefully. The boy asked why the oil mattered. His father smiled. "If we care for simple things," he answered softly, "they care for us longer." The lesson reached beyond the oar itself. The boy nodded. He would remember those words for many years. Farther along the river, a woman washed linen garments upon smooth stones near the shore. She worked slowly. Each piece of cloth was rinsed in the cool water before being gently beaten against the stone to loosen dust collected during the day's labor. Then it was rinsed once more. Finally, she spread the garments across low bushes where the evening breeze would finish drying them. The clean linen fluttered softly, bright white against the green reeds. Birds continued their quiet routines nearby. A kingfisher waited patiently upon a branch overhanging the water. Without warning, it slipped beneath the surface. Moments later it returned with a tiny fish held firmly in its beak. The bird settled once again upon its branch. Its meal complete. Life along the Nile continued in countless small ways that most people hardly noticed. Inside the village, the carpenter's workshop remained busy. The master craftsman inspected a wooden chest nearing completion. Its lid opened smoothly. Its joints fit tightly together. The apprentice polished the surface with fine sand while sunlight entered through the doorway in long golden beams. Tiny particles of wood floated through the air before settling quietly upon the floor. The smell of cedar filled the room. Fresh, warm, comforting. The finished chest would eventually hold folded linen, treasured tools, or perhaps precious family keepsakes. Simple objects often became silent witnesses to many generations. A child might one day inherit it from a grandparent who had once received it as a wedding gift. Wood endured when cared for patiently. Nearby, a basket maker sat beneath the shade of a date palm. Bundles of papyrus lay neatly beside him. His hands worked almost without pause. Long strips crossed one another. Corners slowly formed. The basket gradually rose from the ground beneath his fingers. Several finished baskets already rested nearby. Some would carry grain. Others vegetables. Some would travel upon boats filled with fish. Others might simply store bread inside family homes. The work appeared ordinary. Yet nearly every household depended upon baskets every single day. A gentle breeze rustled the palm leaves overhead. Tiny patches of sunlight danced across the ground. The basket maker smiled quietly. He enjoyed working outside during these cooler hours. He could hear children laughing nearby. He could listen to birds crossing overhead. He could smell bread beginning to bake once more as evening approached. The village itself slowly changed as the afternoon faded. Cooking fires appeared one by one. Thin gray smoke curled upward through still air. The familiar aroma of fresh bread mixed with onions, lentils, herbs, and roasting fish drifted through narrow streets. Dogs lifted their noses. Children smiled. Hungry workers noticed the welcome scents carried by the breeze. Women returned from the river carrying full water jars balanced with remarkable grace. The clay vessels seemed heavy, yet years of practice allowed steady, careful steps. Drops of cool water slid down the sides of the jars, darkening the dusty earth wherever they fell. Neighbors greeted one another as they passed. No conversation needed to be long. A smile. A quiet greeting. A few words about tomorrow's work. These simple exchanges strengthened the small community day after day. At the temple, attendants quietly swept stone courtyards before evening prayers. The warm sunlight touched carved columns whose shadows stretched farther across the smooth paving stones. Incense drifted gently upward. The fragrance lingered among painted walls and silent statues. Even here, where ceremonies followed ancient traditions, the pace remained calm. Nothing felt hurried. The temple itself seemed to breathe with the rhythm of the day. In another corner of the village, an elderly man sat outside his home carving a small wooden toy for his youngest grandson. The piece of wood had once been part of a broken tool handle. Rather than discard it, he had saved it for another purpose. His knife moved slowly. Small curls of wood gathered at his feet. Little by little the rough shape became a tiny duck, its rounded body smooth enough for small hands to hold. The grandfather smiled to himself. Tomorrow he would give it to the child. Perhaps the toy would become a favorite companion for many seasons. Perhaps it would simply be another small happiness in an ordinary childhood. Either possibility was enough. The afternoon light grew warmer with every passing moment. Golden colors settled across rooftops and fields. The river reflected the changing sky like polished bronze. Workers began finishing their final tasks. Tools were cleaned. Baskets emptied. Animals counted. Doors repaired. Nets folded. Every chore quietly prepared the village for another peaceful evening. No one needed to announce that the day was ending. Everyone could feel it. The birds changed their songs. The breeze became cooler. The shadows lengthened across dusty roads. The western desert slowly turned the color of warm honey beneath the lowering sun. And all across ancient Egypt, ordinary people made their gentle journey home, carrying with them the pleasant weariness that follows a day of honest work, knowing that before long the deep darkness would return once more, wrapping the Nile Valley in its familiar silence beneath another sky filled with countless stars. The sun slips quietly beyond the western desert, leaving behind one last ribbon of warm gold that slowly fades into soft shades of violet and deep blue. The Nile reflects those final colors for only a few peaceful moments before the river becomes calm and dark once again. One by one, the day's familiar sounds drift away. The last fisherman ties his boat to a worn wooden post and gives the rope one gentle tug before walking home. The final basket is carried inside a mud brick house. A carpenter brushes away the last curls of cedar from his workshop floor. A farmer leans his wooden hoe against the wall, knowing it will be waiting for him when another dawn arrives. Small cooking fires burn low. The smell of warm bread lingers in the evening air. Families gather close together beneath the quiet glow of simple oil lamps. They share their evening meal without hurry. Gentle voices fill the room for a little while before growing softer as tiredness settles over everyone. Children yawn. Grandparents smile. Parents quietly prepare sleeping mats woven from reeds and linen. Outside, the village slowly disappears into darkness. The lamps inside each home become tiny golden islands surrounded by the deep night. Their gentle flames flicker for a while, dancing softly against mud brick walls before each one is carefully lowered to save precious oil. One flame goes out. Then another. And another. Soon only a few distant lights remain. The rest of the village belongs once more to the stars. Above the Nile, the heavens bloom with quiet light. Thousands upon thousands of stars stretch from one horizon to the other, brighter than almost anyone today could ever imagine. The Milky Way drifts gently across the sky like a pale river flowing beside the great river below. The moon rises slowly. Its silver light touches temple columns that have stood through countless seasons. It rests upon palm leaves that whisper softly in the breeze. It glides across silent canals where water continues its patient journey toward the sea. Nothing asks for attention. Nothing demands to be remembered. The night simply exists, peaceful and complete. Somewhere in the reeds, frogs continue their gentle chorus. A night bird calls once before becoming quiet again. A cool breeze carries the scent of fresh water and damp earth through sleeping villages. The Nile keeps flowing, just as it did yesterday, just as it will tomorrow. For thousands of years, ordinary people lived beside this river. They baked bread before sunrise. They carried water. They mended nets. They shaped clay. They wove linen. They planted grain. They watched the stars. Most left behind no great monuments and no famous names. Yet together, their quiet routines became the heartbeat of ancient Egypt. Their lives were built not from moments of great excitement, but from countless small acts of care repeated day after day. A loaf of bread shared with family. A child learning from patient hands. A lamp carefully protected from the wind. A basket repaired instead of replaced. A peaceful evening spent beneath an endless sky. These simple moments filled the centuries. And perhaps that is the gentlest part of their story. That even in one of history's greatest civilizations, life was most often quiet. The river flowed. The sun rose. The sun set. Darkness returned. Morning came again. As our own journey slowly comes to rest, imagine standing one last time beside the calm waters of the Nile. The village behind you has fallen completely silent. The last lamp has gone out. The moon hangs high above the desert. The stars stretch farther than your eyes can follow. The breeze is cool upon your face. The water moves with its endless, comforting rhythm. There is nowhere else to go. Nothing left to do. Only the quiet river. The peaceful night. And the timeless stillness of ancient Egypt, gently holding the world until morning. May the stars watch over the silent valley. May the Nile continue its endless song. And may the calm of this ancient night carry you softly into a deep, peaceful, and restful sleep.